So now I want to spend a bit of time talking to you about hunger and poverty and coping mechanisms and strategies on an international level. You'll see on the slide that I've shown you a picture of the hunger map that Professor Coots showed you earlier, and you'll see a concentration of the hungry poor here in sub-Saharan Africa. But I want to keep you to keep in mind that although this is the poorest of the poor and the bottom billion that the World Food Program services, by no means are all the poor people just concentrated in these highlighted countries. Going back to Bangladesh and the case study that you guys have seen, Professor Coots talked about the floods and the river erosion problems and the cyclone, and that major natural disasters are continuing to contribute to the vulnerability of the Bangladeshi people, particularly the people that exist in these flooding plains. And the idea is that in Bangladesh there's too many people in the wrong places in this country, and so the same people that are poor and have limited access to resources live in a place that's continually affected by these disasters. The reason I wanted to bring you back to Bangladesh is I wanted to show you this slide about what do people do when they're in this crisis. How do the ultra poor what strategies or survival strategies do they have? In Bangladesh, typically someone in a crisis situation will do what's called a distress sale. I've mentioned this. They might sell an asset, so they might sell a goat or furniture or rent portions of their house. They might sell productive assets, things again like goats or a cow or chickens or something like that that can continually produce for them. And then they move into the sale of their labor. So they might, if they're a migrant worker, they might go to the farm and say, hey, I come and pick every May. Can I get the food now the money in March to pay for food, and then I will still come and work in May. But what that does is it actually sets the farmer up or the migrant worker up to get an advance on their paycheck, but then sets them up for the future to not get any income. And so it's just moving the problem out, but it's moving it to the not distant future. You also see a lot of seasonal migration for employment, so someone might move around the country in order to seek employment. And in doing this, as we've mentioned and as you'll see in the HIV/AIDS lecture, as people are migrating or moving, they're more susceptible to diseases, and they're also more vulnerable because they're removed from their support community. You also see a high incidence rate of loans or borrowing at high interest rates. You see this similar problem here in the United States, things like a title pawn, where someone will pawn off maybe the title to their car or the deed to their house because they need the money right away. But typically, if people are existing in these high pressure, high stress, poverty situations, they get into a situation where the interest rate is too high on the loan, and therefore they're way more likely to default on it and then lose the asset that they did have. In the northern part of Bangladesh that's very insecure, you see people engaging in all 5 of these activities because of the food insecurity. So I wanted to paint a picture of that for you, because when you have people in a destitute place, they're going to resort to these coping strategies, but a lot of times the coping strategies they resort to contributes to keeping them in the situation that they're in. Other coping strategies in the developing world, just to flip to the slide real quick, people might engage in what's called seed eating. So you might have a destitute farmer who relies on saving their seeds to plant the crop for next year, might begin actually eating the seeds that they have. This is a very common problem in the country of Ethiopia. So when an organization like the World Food Program comes in, if they notice that the farmers are eating their seeds, then it's a clue that the farmers are in a very destitute situation, because they're actually eating the livelihood for their future in order to survive today. You also see a lot of what's called urban migration, so people might leave the rural farms and migrate to the cities in order to find employment. This is where a lot of the beggar population comes from. People coming to beg in the cities to then send money back to the rural areas. People who make this urban migration tend to be very vulnerable to human trafficking. A lot of families, if they're in distress, people will come through and convince them, hey, we have a restaurant in the city. If you send your daughter, she can be a waitress there, or we have rich families, she can be a nanny for them. And so the families will send their daughters to the cities to work, and then when the daughters arrive, they actually realize that they're in trafficked situations and can't communicate back to home what's happened, and also can't get out of the situation. You also see major stresses on family structures and social structures due to these coping mechanisms. So when a family is being split up, people are moving around or migrating to the urban centers, you see a splintering of the family unit. And so the people that remain, you see a lot of broken families, you see a lot of families with only one working parent. You know, especially when you see someone who's in a trafficked situation, their family back home has not only lost that person, but they've lost the income of that person and the contact with that person. And so you see a lot of emotional damage, you see a lot of broken families, either divorce or abandonment. You see high orphan populations. The problems tend to just promulgate and build on each other. You also notice a high incidence rate of illegal immigration. So for example, in Zimbabwe, which is an example you'll see in this unit, and also there's a suggested film for you to watch, you see a lot of people in Zimbabwe migrating into South Africa for work, but because they're arriving illegally, they're pushed to the margins of South African society, whereas South African social safety nets and programs are meant to help poor South Africans. Now a lot of the majority of those people that those programs are helping are actually illegal Zimbabwe citizens who have moved into South Africa. You see very similar problems even here in the United States, and recent news with the Alabama state law that passed fairly recently. There's a very extreme backlash of reactions politically against those movements, but the idea, although the actual implementation of the laws, as the Arizona state law has proven, tend to be quite controversial. The ultimate idea is that how can we, and the ultimate question is, how can the immigrants be enticed to actually stay in their home country and receive the services and needs and goods that they're seeking in the country that they're migrating to. But ultimately, I think especially as you become involved in immigrant communities, you find that their goal isn't to live in the new place. Their goal is to try to help alleviate the poverty in the place that they came from. And so, you know, particularly in a country like South Africa, looking at some of the social structures of Zimbabwe, like how can South Africa support the rebuilding of some of the poverty situations that people are coming from so that they can actually go home and return to their villages. So there's a huge dialogue, both domestically and internationally, about trying to help people who are using migration as a coping strategy and mechanism to deal with poverty, of how best to implement those changes, how best to accommodate and deal with those populations as they are moving, and then also how best to help the populations that they're moving to. And so there's a great debate, and there's, I would encourage you to read up on it because it's very intimately linked to hunger and poverty issues, and there's people all along the spectrum that feel very strongly about their views. And so I think it's important to read a wide smattering of viewpoints before making your own decision, which Professor Nkutsar and I are trying to provide you with the tools in order for you to do that. But it's important for you as a student to make that leap yourself and also seek out information and opinions as you are growing in your education to form your own opinions.